New Guinea, 1944, just before first light. The jungle is still. No wind. No birds. Only the slow drip of water from leaves heavy with night rain. A narrow track cuts through the undergrowth, barely visible, half swallowed by roots and shadow. Somewhere beyond it, hidden behind bamboo walls and low timber huts, a Japanese-held village waits for daylight. But daylight will come too late. A small group of Australian commandos moves in silence. No shouted orders. No radios crackling. Only hand signals and memory. Each man knows his place. Each step is measured, careful not to break twigs or disturb the wet soil beneath their boots. They were told to wait. American units were still hours away, delayed by terrain, by planning, by the need to move as one coordinated force. The village was marked for a joint operation. Timed. Structured. Approved. But the patrol in the jungle has already made its decision. The first hut is just ahead now. A faint outline in the gray pre-dawn light. No hesitation. By the time the sun rises over the canopy, the village will already be silent. And the war, in this small corner of it, will have moved forward without permission. 2. Context/background. Section 1. By 1943, what the war in the Pacific had settled into a brutal rhythm. It was no longer about sudden expansion. The rapid Japanese advances of 1941 and early 1942 across Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had slowed. The front lines hardened. What followed was something far more difficult to fight and far harder to control. Distance. Jungle. Isolation. The Allied strategy had begun to shift under the direction of Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area. His plan was deliberate. Bypass heavily fortified Japanese strongholds, isolate them, and move step by step toward the Philippines. It became known as island hopping. On maps, it looked clean, sequential, logical. On the ground, it was anything but. New Guinea became the testing ground for the strategy. A massive, mountainous island, covered in dense rainforest, cut by rivers that flooded without warning, and trails that vanished overnight. Visibility was often measured in meters. Movement was slow, exhausting, and constant. For the Japanese, it offered natural defense. For the Allies, it became a proving ground of endurance. The Japanese forces stationed there, many under the command of Hatazo Adachi and the 18th Army, adopted a defensive posture that relied less on large-scale engagement and more on attrition. They dug into ridgelines, concealed positions in jungle clearings, and established small, fortified villages connected by narrow, hidden tracks. They didn't need to win quickly. They needed to make the enemy bleed slowly. Against this, the Allied forces brought numbers, air power, and supply chains that stretched across oceans. But these advantages weakened the moment soldiers stepped into the jungle. Aircraft could not see through the canopy. Artillery struggled to find targets. Radios failed in wet conditions. And units, sometimes entire companies, could disappear within hours of entering the terrain. For American forces, trained largely for conventional warfare, this environment demanded adaptation. Standard doctrine emphasized coordination, structure, and overwhelming force. Operations were planned carefully, synchronized across units, and supported by logistics that required time to organize. Time was something the jungle did not respect. Australian forces had been fighting in this environment longer. Since early 1942, they had engaged Japanese troops along the Kokoda Track and across the northern coast of New Guinea. These were not clean battles. They were slow, exhausting struggles fought in mud, rain, and close quarters. Lessons were learned the hard way, through attrition, through survival. Units became smaller. Movement became quieter. Command became more flexible. The idea of waiting for perfect coordination, for full support, began to feel less practical when the enemy could vanish overnight. As the Allied command structure expanded in 1943, in integrating American and Australian forces into a unified effort, a subtle tension emerged. Not in open disagreement, but in approach. American command prioritized synchronized operations, multi-unit advances, supported by air cover and artillery, designed to minimize risk through control. Australian field units, particularly the independent companies, later redesignated as commando squadrons, operated differently. They were trained for reconnaissance, raiding, and operating behind enemy lines in small numbers. Their effectiveness depended on initiative, speed, and the ability to act without waiting for confirmation. Both approaches had logic behind them. Both had proven success in different environments. But in the jungles of New Guinea, the gap between doctrine and reality began to widen. A village marked on a map could be empty by the time an operation was approved. An enemy force identified in one location could shift silently overnight. And information, often gathered at great risk by small patrols, could lose its value if not acted on quickly. It was in this space, between planning and opportunity, that decisions began to change. Quietly, individually, on the ground. And sometimes, those decisions would move faster than the command structures designed to control them. Which is where the next part of the story begins, inside the units that were trained not to wait. 2. Context/background, Section 2. The men who moved ahead of the maps were not conventional soldiers. They were drawn from units that had been formed early in the war, when Australia faced the real possibility of invasion. In 1941 and 1942, as Japanese forces pushed southward, the Australian Army began organizing small, highly mobile units designed for a very specific kind of warfare. They became known as the independent companies. Later, they would be reorganized and redesignated as commando squadrons. But their function remained the same. Operate in small groups. Move ahead of larger formations. Gather intelligence. Disrupt enemy movement. And strike where opportunity presented itself. They were not designed to hold ground. They were designed to understand it. Training reflected that purpose. Navigation without clear landmarks. Movement through jungle without leaving trace. Silent communication. Survival with minimal supply. Every man carried what he needed, and little more. There was no reliance on vehicles. No expectation of immediate reinforcement. And often, no guarantee of extraction. They operated under the broader umbrella of organizations like the Allied Intelligence Bureau, which coordinated irregular warfare efforts across the Southwest Pacific. Within this structure, Australian units worked alongside coast watchers, local guides, and The other reconnaissance elements, forming a network that extended far beyond conventional front lines. Information became their primary weapon. A single observation, enemy movement, supply patterns, defensive layout could influence operations miles away, but only if it moved quickly enough. This was where friction began to emerge. In the formal command structure, intelligence flowed upward before it moved outward. Reports were written, transmitted, verified, and then incorporated into operational planning. It was a system designed for clarity and coordination. But in the jungle, time compressed. A patrol might spend days reaching an observation point, another day watching, and then, in a matter of hours, everything could change. A village once occupied might be abandoned. A defensive position might shift. A supply route might disappear entirely. Waiting for confirmation could mean acting on information that was already outdated. For units on the ground, this created a different kind of calculation. Not whether something should be done, but when, and whether waiting would make it impossible. The TFIO, or Japanese forces they faced, operated with a similar understanding of terrain. Small garrisons were often placed in villages that doubled as supply points or communication nodes. These positions were rarely static. Movement was constant, but controlled, shifting just enough to avoid being fixed in place. Engagements were often brief. Sometimes they didn't happen at all. A patrol would move in expecting resistance, only to find empty huts, cold fire pits, and tracks already fading into the jungle floor. This pattern reinforced a simple reality. Opportunities did not last. For the independent, in companies, doctrine began to evolve, not through formal revision, but through repetition in the field. Patrol leaders were given objectives, but the execution increasingly depended on their judgment. If a target was identified, and the conditions were right, waiting became a risk. Acting became the alternative. This was not rebellion against command. It was adaptation to environment. Still, the difference in approach did not go unnoticed. From higher command levels, particularly within American structures, the lack of strict adherence to coordinated timing raised concerns. The operations were designed to work together. One unit moving early could disrupt another. Air support, artillery, and reinforcements depended on synchronization. Control ensured predictability. Predictability ensured safety. But in the jungle, predictability could also mean hesitation. And hesitation could mean absence, arriving where the enemy had already been. By late 1943 and into 1944, these contrasting approaches existed side by side within the same campaigns. Large-scale operations moved according to plan, supported by logistics and firepower. At the same time, smaller units operated ahead of them, often beyond immediate oversight, shaping the battlefield in quieter ways. Most of the time, the system held. Reports were filed. Operations aligned. But occasionally, a moment would present itself, clear, immediate, and temporary. A village occupied. A path exposed. An enemy unaware. And, in that moment, the decision would not come from a headquarters map or a coordinated timetable. It would come from a patrol leader, standing in the jungle, weighing orders against reality, whether to wait or to move. That decision is where the story shifts, from structure to action. 3. Angles. Section 1. In the jungle. War became personal long before it became strategic. For the men in these patrols, The experience was defined not by large movements on a map, but by the space between one step and the next. Visibility was limited. Sound carried unpredictably. A snapped branch. A disturbed patch of earth. These were not small details. They were signals. Every man learned to read them. Fatigue was constant. Clothing rarely dried. Skin remained damp for days. Boots rotted. Rations were limited, often reduced to what could be or carried over long distances. There were no front lines in the traditional sense, only areas of movement and areas of uncertainty. In this environment, discipline looked different. It wasn't about formation or uniformity. It was about awareness. The ability to move without being seen. To stop without being told. To understand intention without words. A patrol might move for hours without speaking. And yet, every man knew exactly what the others were doing. This created a kind of cohesion that didn't rely on command structure alone. It relied on trust, built through shared conditions, not imposed hierarchy. Orders still existed, but they were often distilled into intent rather than instruction. That distinction mattered, because when conditions changed, and they often did, there was no time to request clarification. Decisions had to be made in place, with incomplete information, and accepted immediately by the group. From a tactical perspective, this translated into a form of movement that conventional doctrine struggled to define. There were no fixed routes, no predictable timelines. Patrols adapted constantly, altering direction based on terrain, enemy signs, or simply instinct developed through repetition. The jungle did not allow for rigidity. It punished it. This flexibility gave small units an advantage. They could approach from unexpected directions. They could withdraw without leaving clear traces. And when necessary, they could strike with precision, briefly, decisively, and without drawing prolonged engagement. But this same flexibility introduced risk. Without direct support, any engagement had to be carefully considered. Ammunition was limited. Medical assistance was distant. Extraction, if required, was uncertain. There was no margin for prolonged error. This is where leadership took on a different form. A patrol leader was not just responsible for executing orders. He was responsible for interpreting them in real time. The objective might be clear: reconnaissance, disruption, observation, but the method was fluid. And sometimes, the method became the decision. If a patrol encountered an enemy position that had not been marked, something temporary, something vulnerable, the question was immediate. Report it. And wait, or act, and accept the consequences. There was no standard answer. What existed instead was judgment, shaped by experience, by understanding of terrain, and by the awareness that delay could erase opportunity entirely. From the perspective of higher command, this unpredictability was difficult to integrate. Operations were designed to align. Timelines were established to ensure coordination between units. Air cover, artillery, and ground forces depended on synchronization. A deviation, even a successful one, could introduce complications. But from the ground, the situation appeared differently. A coordinated attack that arrived too late was no longer coordinated. It was irrelevant. And so, within these small units, a quiet pattern began to emerge. Not defiance, but interpretation. Orders were followed, but with an understanding that conditions might require adjustment. That adjustment could be small. A change in route, a shift in timing, or, in rare cases, something more decisive. A complete action taken before the plan had fully formed. And it is in that space between instruction and execution that the next angle reveals itself. 3. Angles. Section 2. From the enemy's perspective. The jungle was not just terrain, it was structure. Japanese forces operating across New Guinea and the surrounding islands had adapted their defensive methods to match the environment. Large, static positions were avoided unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they relied on a network of smaller, concealed positions, often centered around villages that served as temporary supply points, observation posts, or communication links. These villages were not always fortified in the conventional sense. There were no large bunkers or visible emplacements from a distance. What existed instead was integration. Huts built from local materials blended into the landscape. Defensive positions were shallow, often hidden beneath foliage or along natural contours of the ground. Movement between positions followed narrow tracks that could be concealed or erased within hours. To an approaching force without precise information, the village might appear inactive, until it wasn't. This created a defensive advantage rooted in uncertainty. An attacking force had to assume resistance, even when none was visible. And preparing for that resistance required time to coordinate, to position supporting new elements, to ensure that the engagement did not turn into a costly miscalculation. For conventional units, this approach made sense. It reduced risk. It ensured that when contact was made, it would be supported. But it also introduced delay. And delay, in this environment, was something the Japanese understood how to exploit. Units could withdraw quietly, leaving behind minimal trace. Supplies could be relocated. Positions could be abandoned before they were ever engaged. From a psychological standpoint, this created a pattern that affected in both sides. For Allied forces, there was a growing sense that the enemy was always just beyond reach, seen briefly, then gone. Engagements became less frequent, but no less dangerous. The uncertainty of contact meant that every movement carried tension, but not always resolution. For Japanese forces, the ability to control when and where contact occurred reinforced their defensive posture. They did not need to win every engagement. They needed to avoid being fixed in place long enough for larger Allied operations to take effect. In this context, the idea of acting without full coordination became more complex. It was not simply a matter of initiative. It was a matter of timing against an opponent who valued withdrawal as much as defense. For Australian patrols operating ahead of main forces, this dynamic was understood through experience. They had seen positions vanish overnight. They had followed tracks that led to nothing. They had arrived at objectives only to find absence instead of resistance. Each of these moments reinforced a single idea. If the enemy was present now, that fact alone had value. And that value diminished with time. This created a psychological tension within the patrol itself. The men knew their role was reconnaissance, to observe, report, and allow larger forces to act. But they also understood the consequences of delay. If they waited, the opportunity might disappear. If they acted, they risked operating outside the structure designed to support them. This was not a simple calculation. It involved weighing immediate advantage against long-term coordination. A successful engagement might remove an enemy position, but it might also disrupt a planned operation. It might create confusion within command. It might expose the patrol into retaliation without support. There was no guarantee that acting would be recognized as correct. Only that waiting might lead to nothing at all. From the perspective of higher command, particularly within American structures, this unpredictability remained a concern. Reports that arrived too late to act on were frustrating. But actions taken outside coordination raised different questions. Control was not just about success. It was about consistency. An operation that worked once, under specific conditions, could not always be repeated. Doctrine required patterns that could be applied broadly. Independent actions, even when effective, did not always translate into repeatable strategy. And yet, on the ground, patterns were already forming. Not formal ones, but practical ones. If a position was lightly held, if movement could be concealed, if withdrawal routes were clear, then action, immediate, contained, and precise, became a viable option. Not standard, but possible. It is within this balance between enemy behavior, environmental pressure, and human judgment that the moment begins to take shape. A village identified, an opportunity observed, and a decision that will not wait for confirmation. 4. Climax. Section 1. New Guinea. Early 1944, approximately 03. 40 hours. The jungle is darker now than it was an hour ago. Cloud cover has settled low over the canopy, blocking what little moonlight had filtered through. Movement becomes slower. Not from hesitation, but from necessity. Every step must be placed by feel as much as sight. The patrol has already been moving for hours. They left their temporary position shortly after midnight, carrying only what they could manage without noise. No unnecessary equipment. No excess weight. The objective had been clear when it was first relayed. Observe the village. Confirm presence. Report. And wait. The last part was understood, but not repeated. Now, less than 100 meters from the outer edge of the settlement, the patrol halts. No words are spoken. The lead scout lowers himself slowly, one knee pressing into damp soil. Hand raised just enough for those behind to see. The signal passes back in silence. The line compresses. Movement stops. Ahead, through a break in the foliage, the shape of the village begins to form. Low structures. Thatched roofing. A faint outline of a central clearing. And then, confirmation. Light. Not bright. Not exposed. But present. A small flame. Partially shielded. Possibly a cooking fire. Possibly a guard position. More shapes emerge as the eyes adjust. Subtle movement. A figure passing between structures. Another. Stationary. Near the edge of the clearing. The village is occupied. The information is immediate. Clear. Valuable. Under standard procedure. This is where the patrol withdraws. Return to a safe distance. Transmit the report. Allow command to assess. Coordinate with supporting units. Plan an engagement that integrates air support, artillery, and ground forces. Time frame. Hours. At minimum. Possibly longer. The patrol leader watches for several minutes. Not rushing. Not assuming. He studies the pattern of movement. The spacing between figures. The absence of larger defensive structures. No visible or perimeter fortifications. No heavy weapons emplacements. This is not a hardened position. It is a temporary one, which means it can disappear. The men behind him remain still. They do not ask what comes next. They already understand the possibilities. If they withdraw now, the report will be accurate, but delayed. By the time a coordinated force arrives, the village may already be empty. Another position erased. Another opportunity passed. If they act now, the conditions are in their favor. Darkness. Proximity. Surprise. But also isolation. No support will reach them in time if something goes wrong. No artillery will soften the position. No aircraft will intervene. What exists is only what is here, and what can be done before the first shot changes everything. The patrol leader shifts slightly, scanning the perimeter again. Counting. Estimating. There are no clear numbers, but the scale is limited. A small garrison. Possibly a forward element. Enough to hold the village, but not to defend it against a sudden, close-range assault. He lowers his hand. Not to signal withdrawal, but to bring the others forward. The movement is subtle. One by one, the men adjust their positions. The line spreads, forming a loose arc around the outer edge of the village. Each man selecting cover, aligning angles, preparing without sound. No one speaks. There is no formal order given, but the intent is understood. They are not waiting. The final check is brief. Weapons are ready. Positions are set. Distances are known. The first light of dawn is still far enough away to maintain concealment, but close enough that delay will begin to work against them. The patrol leader looks once more at the clearing. The figures are still moving. Unaware. Unhurried. For a moment. Everything is balanced. The plan that exists elsewhere, and the reality that exists here. Then, without signal beyond what has already been given, the decision is made, and the patrol begins to move. 4. Climax. Section 2, approximately 04.